call it a tax collector, rhymes with Grug. I call this a dishwasher, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a stove, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a food pantry, rhymes with Grug. I call this craft, rhymes with Grug. And I call this TV, rhymes with Grug. And I call this the pool, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a bike, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a vacuum, rhymes with Grug. I call this a couch, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a lunchbox, rhymes with Grug. I call this a chair, rhymes with Grug. I call this a plate, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a microwave, rhymes with Grug. I call this bread, rhymes with Grug. I call this pictures, rhymes with Grug. And I call this another picture, rhymes with Grug. I call this a keyboard, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a laptop, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a mouse, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a poster, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a TV, rhymes with Grug. And I call these action figures, rhymes with Grug. I call this a Hot Wheels Mega Garage, rhymes with Grug. And I call this Jurassic Park, rhymes with Grug. And I call these medals, rhymes with Grug. I call this rings, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a drawing, rhymes with Grug. And I call this headphones, rhymes with Grug. And I call these boxing gloves, sparring gloves I meant, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a high five award, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a closet, rhymes with Grug. I call these credentials, rhymes with Grug. And that's pretty much it of how no, not let me keep going. I call these caps, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a backpack, rhymes with Grug. And I call these a squishmallow, rhymes with Grug. And I call this a plushie, rhymes with Grug.